highly appropriate. So let's see where we go. As Sasha said, we're back today in the book of 1 Samuel. And when we started this series, I pointed out that rather than taking an exhaustive chapter-by-chapter approach, my plan was to compare the lives of Saul and David, the first two kings of Israel, and to use that to highlight some of the important themes in the book. As we've gotten into the series, though, I've found that to be a bit artificial, I guess. And I think it is always important that we let the Bible speak for itself, rather than forcing it into some preconceived mould. And the result of that is that over the next 3 weeks, I won't be focusing on the comparisons. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on Saul, his fear in chapters 13 and 14, his failure and rejection by God in chapter 15, and his jealousy of David, which begins in chapter 18 but becomes a major thread running through the rest of 1 Samuel. And as I've mentioned to a few people already this week, I do think there's a certain irony. I'm closing my time here as lead pastor with 3 sermons about the flaws of a failed leader. But I don't mind that. It suits my sense of humour very much. And I quite like the idea of clearing the decks for Pastor Terry so that he can start with a series on David, which I can only think will be a lot more positive. Just to be clear, though, in case any of you are worrying about my state of mind, while I can sympathise with some of Saul's failings, particularly from our passage this morning, I don't feel like a failure. I don't feel that I've been rejected, and I certainly don't feel jealous. So don't worry about any of that. This morning, we're looking at 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 14, and what I would call Saul's problem with fear. Saul's problem with fear. Now, what do I mean by that? Who or what is Saul afraid of, and why is it a problem? You might think that Saul was afraid of the Philistines, and that would be perfectly understandable. They were Israel's biggest enemy at the time. But no, Saul's fear is not of the Philistines, but of Israel. He's most concerned about the people on his side, the ones that he's supposed to lead and rule. And we can actually see some of that very early, from the very beginning of Saul's story. When I spoke a few weeks ago about the call and anointing of Saul and David, we read that when Saul was first called as king of Israel, when they cast lots and his name was drawn, Saul wasn't there because he was hiding among the bags. He was hiding among the supplies. And I asked the question in passing, was that modesty or was it fear? Saul seemingly was reluctant to be acknowledged as king. He knew what was coming. Samuel had already told him. He knew that that was the result. But he's still hiding. Was that because he was modest and didn't think that highly of himself, or was it because he was afraid of how people would react? And ultimately, I think it's a bit of both. Saul knew he came from a minor family from the smallest tribe of Israel. He knew there would be people who wouldn't accept him as king. And in fact, we're told that once he has been dragged out from among the bags, some scoundrel said, "How can this fellow save us?" They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent. So he did have enemies. Saul knew there were people, Israelites, his own people, who genuinely hated him. And he chose to keep silent, not to confront it in that moment. Now we know from what happens next that Saul did become king. He was prepared to take on that responsibility, so it's not that Saul was flat out refusing the job. So I think a part of this is that Saul didn't want to be seen as putting himself forward. He didn't want to be seen as grasping, claiming the kingship out of ambition. Maybe he knew that would put more people off. So yes, I think Saul was modest. I think he was afraid. And I think also that he's a bit of a people pleaser. And that's the kind of fear I'm talking about. The fear of people. The fear of what people will think of you. The fear of letting them down or being rejected. And that is where it becomes a problem. Not thinking too highly of yourself is good. There's nothing wrong with modesty or humility, but if it means you're too concerned with what other people think about you, that is a problem, especially if you're a leader, because your priorities will be wrong and you will wind up making bad decisions. And we see a couple of examples of that in our passage this morning, because Saul is trying to please not God, but his army. So again, as I've done with a couple of these passages, the longer passages in 1 Samuel, I'm not going to read the whole lot. In a sense, I'm going to retell the story, and I'm going to dive in and read the verses that are most important. At the beginning of chapter 13, we're told Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. And now that sounds very impressive. It's a solid beginning. It is worth noting there that there are some old manuscripts that say 2 years rather than 42 years, which makes it a little less impressive. But he's king. He has that position of authority, and he gathers to himself a standing army of 3,000 men. Not the militia, not all the farmers and tradespeople who can fight, but a standing army of soldiers. 2,000 with Saul in one location and another 1,000 with Saul's son Jonathan a bit further away. Both are towns just north of Jerusalem, so they're in the tribal area of Benjamin. Saul's in his home state, if you like. He's in his area of strength. But this is still good strategy, right? Two forces, both able to support one another, both close to the centre around Jerusalem, around a centre of power. It's very kingly behaviour. And Jonathan, from there, takes it upon himself to attack a Philistine outpost. And we're going to see that actually becomes a bit of a habit for Jonathan. Saul, knowing that the Philistines are going to retaliate, calls the people to fight with him at Gilgal. Battle is imminent. Saul has his army. He now has the militia with him, the whole fighting force of Israel. But the Philistine army is huge. And the Israelites are scared. Some go into hiding. Some even go so far as to flee the country, crossing the Jordan into Gad and Gilead. Saul knows his army is on the verge of complete collapse. It's on the verge of panic. But he's supposed to wait for Samuel. Samuel may not be the judge anymore. He's not the leader in that sense, but he is still the recognized prophet of Israel. Samuel is supposed to come to offer sacrifices to God, to inquire of God, so that God can tell Israel how they should fight this mighty army, or in fact, whether they should fight this mighty army. Now, Samuel is a famous man. He's a renowned holy man. His presence with the troops will reassure them. And even more than that, offering sacrifices, calling on the name of the Lord, all of that is a big morale boost. It's important for frightened men on the verge of panic. But Samuel's running late. He said he'd be there in 7 days, and he's not. And Saul feels like he's running out of time. So he gives the instructions and he makes the burnt offering himself. And sure enough, as soon as he's done that, that's when Samuel turns up. I'm reading now from verse 10. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favour. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time, but now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Now, of course, at this point, Samuel doesn't know about David. He's speaking prophetically. This is what God has revealed to him in the moment. And the problem was that only the priests, only the people from the tribe of Levi were supposed to offer these sacrifices to God. Saul was king. He had the highest position in the land. He'd even briefly been a prophet in one of the earlier chapters, but he was not a priest. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, not the tribe of Levi. He wasn't authorized to do what he had done, and so he broke the Lord's command. And Samuel tells him very plainly of the consequence. It's not immediately disastrous. It's not that the Lord will cause Israel to be defeated. But it cuts off Saul's legacy. Any prospect of a line of Saul, as we talk about the line of David, is gone. It's ended. And Israel is still in a very bad way. Remember, Saul started with 3,000 soldiers plus the militia. We find that Saul now only has about 600 men left with him. Only a fifth of his standing army have stuck around. And they're not even properly armed. The Philistines wouldn't let the Israelites have blacksmiths for precisely this reason. So only Saul and Jonathan have swords. Now, to put that in perspective, to know just how bad this is, Saul and his army are outnumbered 10-1 by the enemy's charioteers alone. Not their infantry, not their cavalry, just the people riding chariots. It's a bad situation. But it's at this point that without his father's knowledge, Jonathan goes off with only his personal attendant, his armor bearer, to scout out another Philistine outpost. This one is defended by about 20 men, and it's protected by 2 sets of high cliffs. It's not a great prospect. But here's what Jonathan has to say. I'm reading now from chapter 14, verse 6. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." So they climb up, attack the Philistines, kill them all. Now it's the Philistines' turn to be scared. A great panic sweeps through their army, and in this case we're told it was a panic sent by God. So this is serious. And there's confusion in the Israelite camp as well. It's not immediately clear who has attacked or what they should do. But Saul could be decisive when he chose, and as the noise increases in the Philistine camp, he rallies Israel, they attack, they rout the Philistines. Although by this time the Philistines are fighting amongst themselves. They're killing each other. And it's clear from the text that really it's God. It's God who wins the battle. That should be cause for rejoicing, right? Hurrah, 3 cheers, God has won the day. But in fact, it gives rise to a new problem. Saul is so keen to wreak his vengeance on the Philistine army that he's bound all of his fighting men with an oath. "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." It's a stupid thing to do. It's just dumb. The men are starving. They've been standing around scared. They probably haven't been eating properly already, and now they're supposed to go out and fight on an empty stomach. They're not as effective. They're almost faint from hunger. And worse, not everyone hears about it in time. Jonathan, who, remember started this whole thing, was probably on his way back to camp when Saul announced this edict. He doesn't hear about it. So Jonathan takes some honey from a hive of wild bees and eats it, the only person to do so. Now, obviously that's bad, but the consequences aren't immediately apparent. It's not even the biggest problem. Some of the men, exhausted from the fighting, seize some of the plunder, the cows, the sheep, livestock. They kill the animals and eat them without slaughtering them properly, so the meat was eaten with the blood, which was against God's law. Saul, to his credit, sees this, calls them on it, orders them to do the right thing, and in fact gives them the means to do it properly. But later, when Saul plans to continue the attack by night, one of the priests urges him to first inquire of the Lord. Saul does, but God doesn't answer, which Saul, I think, correctly takes as a sign that someone has sinned. God no longer supports their cause. They cast lots. Much more common practice in the Old Testament. See that quite a bit in these chapters. They cast lots using the Urim and the Thummim, which are tools that God had designed to allow the priests to ask after his will. It was a way of discerning who God wanted or what God wanted to do. So they cast these lots. First, it's between Saul and Jonathan on one side and the rest of the army on the other. And then it's between Saul and Jonathan, and the lot falls to Jonathan. The sin is found to lie with Jonathan. Just reading between the lines, I wonder whether Saul already knew something was up. Why would you frame that first question that way? There's a problem somewhere in the camp, so I'm going to put myself and my son over here on our own, and everyone else is over there. I don't understand that. And bearing in mind that Saul has already said by this point, as surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. And when Jonathan confesses to eating the honey, Saul doesn't back down. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan. So this is verse 45 now. But the men said to Saul, should Jonathan die, who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he wasn't put to death. So, two situations, one at the start, one at the end, two mistakes. And I say mistake very cautiously, because in human terms, both are perfectly understandable, reasonable decisions, even good decisions. In the first case, the men are panicking, hiding in barrels, thickets, holes in the ground. Saul doesn't know when Samuel will arrive. He doesn't know how much time he has before the Philistines attack. So he tries, as their leader, to boost his army's morale. Later, having made a stupid vow, he puts his own son Jonathan in harm's way. And I think you'd have to say that despite all the big talk, Saul doesn't want to kill Jonathan. His men don't want him to kill Jonathan. That would be a terrible outcome. And their protests give Saul the opportunity to back down while still saving face. So it's hard to be really critical of either decision, even though Samuel makes clear that Saul's first actions were wrong. Even though Saul brings on himself God's curse by failing to deal with Jonathan. Remember, he said, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die. But whatever we think about it, there is a problem, because there's a trend here. Saul is more concerned with what his army thinks than with what God thinks. He's more concerned with their approval than with God's favour. Keeping people happy is more important to him than obeying God. And next week we're going to see the same thing happen when Saul's army plunders the Amalekites rather than destroying them as God had ordered. And then it does lead to Saul's rejection. Just compare that for a moment with Jonathan. In between these two events, in between Saul's two actions, Jonathan raids the Philistine army, and what does he say? Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. Jonathan, unlike his father, puts God's will first, because he respects God's power. He fears God's power. Saul fears men. And it's actually a very, very common problem. For those of you who know some of the other scriptures, you might think of Pilate presenting Jesus to the crowd after the trial. Pilate surrenders his judgment, his right to deliver judgment to the crowd, because he's afraid. Or King David, even King David in his old age, takes a census. He counts his fighting men. Rather than trusting in God's protection as he has done all his life, he worries about the size of his army. I know I do it too. I try to put God first in my decision making, but I really don't like conflict. And I like to be liked. I don't care about popularity as such, but I want people to think well of me. And that has meant in times that I haven't led as I should, and I've made bad decisions. And I'm sorry about that. If we accept Jesus as Lord, he gets first say. It's what he thinks of us that's most important. Our goal should be to take the words from Jesus' parable, to hear God say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Jesus himself warns, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Following Jesus will lead to conflict. He also says in John 17, I think it is, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Seeking human approval is entirely normal. And sometimes it's the right thing to do, even. But it's God's approval that matters. If Jesus is Lord, then we have to be willing to take risks. We have to be willing to be unpopular, to go against the crowd if that's what we have to do to obey God. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of man is the beginning of sin. And I say that confidently, although only the first part is directly from Scripture. Let's take some other verses in support. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses tells Israel, "Do not show partiality in judging, hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God." The writer of Hebrews says in chapter 13, say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" But I think perhaps the clincher goes to Paul. Paul faced this same issue in his ministry, about the issue of accepting Gentiles into a Jewish church. And he writes in Galatians chapter 1, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I was still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." That's a tough fork in the road. And it can apply in all sorts of ways. But in terms of application, I just want to focus on one. And probably, if you've been here for a while, you know where I'm going with this. It's evangelism. As followers of Jesus, we are all called to share the good news of salvation, the good news that the kingdom of God has drawn near. Some people are gifted as evangelists. Relatively few, it seems to me, but maybe that's just the circles I walk in. Some people are specifically empowered for that type of ministry. But we are all witnesses. We are all ambassadors of reconciliation. We are all commissioned to go and make disciples. And we know that. And I've spoken about it plenty of times. We know and we believe that evangelism is important. But for many of us, there is this huge gap, just this disconnect between what we know, what we say we value, and what in practice we do. There are exceptions. Frank and Michelle with Gideons, Josh and Corey doing street evangelism, Amy with AFES, Margaret Walker any chance she gets. Norm and Tom deserve mention there. The motorsports ministry of Tony, Diane, and Adam and Connie, Kim. And doubtless there are people here, many of you in fact, who are faithful followers of Christ and who live that out in your lives, who seek to show people Jesus' love by the way you live from day to day. And actually that's not bad, to the point where I feel almost I should apologise for this, that maybe I'm being a bit unfair. But if you think about those exceptions that I gave, they're mostly people who have taken it upon themselves to do something. They're things that are happening outside the core business of Ellenbrook Baptist Church. We've run Alpha twice and had barely any takers. I tried to run the Mark drama and couldn't get an acting team. We had the AFES mission team visit 3 times and less than a handful of people went out door knocking with them. We've struggled to connect the Parenting Grove, which is an amazing relationship building ministry, with any deeper sharing of the gospel. There's more happening in the Parenting Grove these days, which I find wonderful, but there's very little. In fact, there's basically no intentional evangelism around it. Now, I hate sounding negative. And I know if there's any fault here, it lies first with me. I have to be willing to lead the way before I can expect you to follow. It's part of the reason why I felt the time had come to leave. Because I truly believe that discipleship, following Christ, requires a higher level of commitment. And until I can model that, I'm not the right person. So please hear me that I'm not trying to condemn. I'm the first person in that boat. And I also know that Pastor Terry is very keen to help bridge the gap between knowledge and actions. I'm excited to see where that could lead. But as a fundamental, we have to ask the question, are we more afraid of people or of God? Are we more afraid of people's ridicule or that without Christ they're going to hell? Saul feared men. He feared people. He had his priorities wrong and he made bad decisions. I fear men. Less than I used to, but it's still an issue. As I said, I've struggled to keep my priorities straight and I've made some bad decisions. But hear me, this isn't just a leadership issue. It's not just for kings and pastors, it's an obedience issue. I could say that, if you believe that being saved and having a relationship with God is the best thing there is, if you believe that those who aren't saved are going to hell, then surely you will talk to your friends, your families, your neighbours. I want to say anyone who will listen about God's gift of grace and the cross of Christ. But it shouldn't really matter. Because Jesus believed those things. In fact, he knew them to be true. And he's the one who's telling you to share the gospel. And I don't accept that it's too hard. It's been a while since we had the Gideon's training course, but there are a lot of resources available if you don't feel equipped to share the good news of Jesus. More than that, you don't need a special technique. And I want to make that really clear. If you know Jesus, then you have your own story of how God has acted in your life. Share that. What I do accept is that it is hard, because often it feels really forced. It feels like a sales pitch, and that's really uncomfortable. I get that. I feel it too. And that's why hospitality is a key part of our strategic plan. The whole idea is to create spaces in our lives that we can share with other Christians and with non-Christians, that we would have opportunities to share our faith without it being forced. So having said that, I am going to force you. Here's your homework. This week, share a meal with a non-Christian. Go to lunch with a work colleague. Have your family over to dinner. Invite your neighbours for a barbecue, whatever you like. In the lead up and during the time that you share together, pray like crazy that God would open up natural opportunities to talk about Jesus and about how good he is. Not how good EBC is, not how good Ellenbrook Baptist is, that's not the idea at all. How good God is. Focus on that. And then as you gather together in the weeks after, whether it's at Connect groups or here at church, talk to one another. Share with one another how you went, pray for each other, encourage each other. The whole point of this history of the kings, from 1st and 2nd Samuel to 1st and 2nd Kings, is to show the limitations of human rule and to set the stage for God's chosen king, Jesus. In the end, God is the one who reigns. It's his approval that matters. Stop making the same mistakes Saul made and let that flow through into your evangelism. Let it stir up in you a willingness to join God in his mission for the lost. Forgive me if I've spoken too strongly, but I needed to say that. And I believe it's what this passage is teaching. So I won't back away from it. I'm going to invite Sasha and Nick back up, and we'll give you some time to think while we close with a song. Thanks, everyone. Amen.